Well, welcome back. You're going to hear from me again. I'm going to talk about Ronald Coase's views on the conduct of economics, which Ning touched on earlier. Here we go. Ronald Coase held very consistent views of economics throughout his long life. As Alexander mentioned, I won't try to say how many hours, but he lived to be 102. And he didn't always acknowledge that there were changes in economics. I think Oliver Williamson mentioned that happened in many cases because of his work. Yet the criticism he made of economics is still germane today, and he didn't, and many of the changes in economics were inspired by his work. This thing is moving forward. Okay. The essence of his ideas about the methodology of economics and the conduct of research in general, I'm going to try to summarize in 3 words: realism, institutions, and alternatives. And I'll explain as I go along what I mean by that. Ronald Coase argued that economists were not really studying the real world. He compared economics critically to biology. He said, well, if Darwin were to come back to Earth today, he would be amazed at how much biology has progressed since the origin of species. Whereas if Adam Smith came back today and looked at economics, he would be amazed at how little has changed. Coase believed that the kind of progress that biology had made in explaining the world and interpreting the world around us was the goal, should be the goal for economics. It was the task of economics to discover and understand the workings of the economic system, consumers, firms, institutions. But economists, he said, aren't studying that. He argued that the entities that, whose decisions economists are analyzing have no real substance. We're not looking at human beings. When we look at consumers, we're looking at a consistent set of preferences. We're not looking at a firm, but at a black box, a cost curve and a demand curve. And on top of that, when we look at markets, we don't look at the institutions. We don't look at the role of the law, of contracts, of information, of all of those important institutions that raise transaction costs. So what do we got? According to Coase, we have consumers without humanity, firms without organization, and exchange without markets. Coase was particularly critical of what he termed Blackboard Economics. By that he meant factors of production are moved around, taxes are imposed, subsidies are granted, prices go up and down, and a social optimum is achieved. But it's all happening on the blackboard. It's misleading because there's no counterpart to the teacher to make that social optimism come true. And we are ignoring the real world of market failure and government failure and of institutions. He termed this a system which lives in the minds of economists, but not on Earth, and so has little relevance for practice, for policies in practice. And he felt that economists were too enamored of technique, that technique should only be of interest as a way of achieving the main goal, and that we should be more eclectic in our choice of technique rather than focusing only on econometrics. On theory, Coase's views about theory are probably the most controversial part of his views on methodology. He was accused by Richard Posner of being anti-theory, and part of that stems from a paper he wrote called the Nutter Lecture in 1982 that took to task Milton Friedman's view that theory should be a test, or that the test of a good theory is how well it predicts. And Coase argued, well, that's not what's happening in economics. We're not actually testing rival theories against one another based on how well they predict. Instead, what we do, in his view, was that we find the statistical results that best fits our theory. And he put this succinctly as, if you torture the data enough, nature will always confess. And if it doesn't, and we don't find that the statistical results support our theory, then we call for further study. Now, he may have gone overboard in being critical of analytical rigor in economics, and Sam Peltzman, for example, in a 2011 article pointed out that by pretending to be a positive science, economic gains a rigor that is useful. But in some respects, I think many of us can be sympathetic with his point of view about overemphasis on the theoretical side and on technique. So what Coase was looking for is summarized by these two quotes: generalizations that are derived from studies that are actually carried out within different institutional frameworks, and a theory that serves as a basis for thinking, helping us to organize our thoughts. When it came to case studies, Coase was also critical of economics. He felt, again, that we weren't being realistic, and the example for this is The Lighthouse in Economics that he published in 1974. In that paper, he took to task a number of economists, including John Stuart Mill and Samuelson, all the way to Samuelson, for their use of the lighthouse as a classic example of a public good. The lighthouse saves lives, it saves money, and there's no way to prevent free riders because the ships that move along the coast benefit from the light even if they haven't paid any money to sustain the light. And Samuelson went further, saying that if we were to charge for something as important as the lighthouse, it would discourage shipping. Coase studied the lighthouse and discovered that in the UK, in the United Kingdom, most lighthouses had been operated and built by private individuals in 1820, and that there was a period there where a lot of lighthouses were being built and maintained by tolls levied on the ships that came into port, and they earned enough money that way to be able to support a private lighthouse. And there was no evidence that he uncovered of an adverse effect on shipping. So what he said was, no one has made a comprehensive study of lighthouse finance. The lighthouse is simply picked out of the air to serve as an illustration. So Coase was very critical of this approach to economics and called on us to use realistic cases. He was not aiming for description for its own sake, but rather to help us understand the important choices and outcomes that are being made. The second point is institutions. Institutions were critical for Coase, and he argued it makes little sense for economists to discuss the process of exchange without specifying the institutional setting within which the exchange takes place, since this affects the incentives to produce and the costs of transacting. Well, you think about that. If it affects the incentives and it affects the costs, what could be more critical? Whoops, this thing is moving forward without me. For him, the definition of economics was the study of social institutions which bind the economic system together. We need to understand the internal operation and decisions of firms. Whoops, just lost that. The internal operation and decisions of firms, as well as decisions about firm boundaries. We want to study the process of contracting, how laws impact the workings of markets, and the costs of government action and results. So clearly, institutions are a critical feature of economic study for Coase. The third word, if you remember, was alternatives. Coase argued that we should analyze alternatives, and I'm going to clarify that with two examples. The first example comes from this paper he did on the Federal Communication Commission on allocation versus auctions of spectrum property rights, rights to airways. And the second is from the problem of social cost, which is the control over harmful effects, like pollution, of economic activity through taxes or other means. So let's look at the allocation versus auction idea. At the time that Coase wrote this paper, most rights to use the spectrum, to use the airways, were allocated by the Federal Communications Commission. And that license meant a big windfall profit for whoever got the license. The FCC argued, well, this is important to prevent one owner or one operator from interfering with another in the radio spectrum. And that was prohibited and regulated by government. But Coase went on to point out, well, that can cause censorship. And you could have the FCC, as in this cartoon, blocking out offensive parts of the cartoon. But they didn't even have to do that. They could regulate offensive contact through raised eyebrows, because the license holder would be so sensitive to their raised eyebrow that they would self-censor. And that, he said, is a threat to freedom of speech. So what would be the result of auctions, which was what Coase was arguing for, if we auctioned off property rights to spectrum? Well, instead of windfall profits, government would earn a lot of revenues from the sale. Interference might still occur, but the owners of the property rights would have every incentive to try to prevent that and to challenge it in court if necessary to keep that from happening. There would be less government interference in the content, so you would secure freedom of speech, and those property owners would have more incentive to invest and adapt to changes. And so you get new technology and a lot of benefits that way. Now, when he presented this paper, the FCC commissioner asked, is this all a big joke? As you heard earlier from Lee, the reaction to this was one of incredulity, and he was laughed at for making such a suggestion. It took 34 years for auctions to be implemented in the United States, and they began in 1994 and are now used in over 30 countries. And Hazlitt and others have estimated the revenues from 1994 to 2009 of over $53 billion. Avoided welfare losses of $17 billion. Not all of the spectrum is auctioned. It's mainly the part that's used for cell phones. But it's been a success story in many respects. And this is a product of Coase's approach, in part of comparing alternatives. Let's move on to another way of comparing alternatives. I don't know if I can bring it up. There we go. Which is on harmful effects, what many economists call externalities. So when an economic activity has a harmful effect on someone else, for example, when an airport's noise causes the little boy's ears to hurt, the standard approach in economics at the time of Coase's article was to impose a tax, as advocated by famous economist Pijou. But Coase pointed out that we are ignoring that this is a reciprocal problem. Alexander mentioned that Coase used to play chess against himself. Well, it is a reciprocal problem in the sense that it's the interaction between the airport and the neighbors that creates this problem. So, what are some of the alternatives if we follow Coase's approach that could be used instead? Well, one thing, of course, is to regulate airport noise, to prohibit it, or make the airlines use less noisy aircraft, or make them follow a particular flight path. If you've flown into Reagan National, you know you go along the Potomac River in this serpentine flight path. That's to avoid houses. Or, given it's a reciprocal problem, you could prohibit neighboring property from being built on so that no one can build in the flight path. If you give property rights and they are clearly defined and you have clear liability laws, then you create incentives for both parties, and you could have lawsuits by property owners who object to noise in their neighborhood. And if you have bargaining and incentives, again, a lot depends on the institutional framework, the property rights and liability rules. Maybe the airport would pay households to induce them to soundproof their home or even wear earplugs. Or maybe the neighbors would pay the airlines to change their flight paths or use quieter planes or close the airport at 10 o'clock at night. Now, Coase pointed out that all of these remedies are going to have costs, and his view was that a satisfactory analysis of policy can only come from a patient study of how, in practice, the markets, firms, and governments handle the problem of harmful effects. He was not advocating a specific policy, but an approach. So what he was saying is we're going to look at the total product yielded by alternative social arrangements. And once again, it's important to be realistic in this, Coase argued. We're not comparing ideal states, a laissez-faire, perfect market with a perfect government. No kind of ideal world here, but one which approximates what we actually see, what actually exists. So the idea is to study that way. And pay close attention to any remedies that are advocated, because sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Don't overlook that whatever remedies you come up with have effects throughout the system, and they have their own costs. Now, I don't think a lot of economists follow this approach, and one reason, of course, is it's very difficult, but another reason is that you may not be rewarded for all your hard work, and I'll come to that in a minute. So what was Coase's advice? So realism, institutions, alternatives. Study the real world, focus on the institutions, don't assume them away, and analyze the practical alternatives. What about publication and getting tenure? What about the incentives of young economists to do that? That's a continuing problem and not one that Coase really addressed. Coase's goal was to understand the economic system to get to the truth. He believed that economics should be useful, and in the rest of this conference, we're going to present some examples of insightful papers that follow in that tradition. And we're also going to discuss how can we motivate young scholars to follow Coase's lead and analyze the economic system in order to get to the truth. Thank you.